On Monday, 5th December 1910, a gruesome discovery was made at a house in Aston, Birmingham, shortly before midday. The daughter of the landlord of the property, Mrs. Hayes, had gone to collect the rent from a house at the back of 86 Park Lane, where the Pope family lived. At around 10:30, she knocked, but received no answer, so thinking that Mrs. Pope had gone on an errand, she returned a little later. She knocked again, but still with no answer, she looked through the window. It was then she saw the tenant of the house, Walter Pope, sitting dead on a chair in the kitchen with a wound to his throat. She also saw Mrs. Pope lying on the hearth with a similar wound. She immediately called the police. What they found shocked the community. Walter Pope was a hard-working, well-liked 26-year-old who'd worked at Tubes Limited in Catherine Street in Aston since he was 19 years old as a machine hand. He was regarded as one of their best men, earning 30 shillings a week. He worked 1 week day shift and the next night shift. He was last seen leaving his work on the Saturday lunchtime when his day shift had ended and was expected to return on the Monday night. His wife, Clara, looked after their 2 children, Clara Elsie, aged 2 years 10 months, and Bernard George, who was around 18 months old. According to neighbours, the family were quiet and well conducted, but Pope was described as a very reserved and sober man. They had only moved into their home 6 weeks earlier, having lived with Mrs. Pope's parents in Portland Street. When the property was entered by Detective Inspector Jackson, Detective Sergeant Boulton and Detective Tustin, they came across a horrific scene. Blood was everywhere, and the bodies of the couple's 2 children were also discovered, lying on a table. All 4 had had their throats cut. Mrs. Pope had been seen around midday the day before the discovery was made, and she seemed to be her usual self. She had exchanged a few pleasantries with a neighbour regarding the weather, a favourite UK pastime. Neighbours later told the police they'd heard nothing through the night, no sounds of a struggle, nor any shouting or crying. Dr. Hart Barry, who arrived at the scene at the same time as the police, suspected that due to the condition of the bodies, the murders had taken place around midnight. On Mrs. Pope's body there were signs of a violent struggle. As their bed hadn't been slept in, it was surmised the couple had been arguing in the kitchen, especially due to the generally overturned condition of the premises. It appears she had fought for her life, as when she was found, her arms were outstretched, as if to protect herself from the razor that had ended it. Pope had then turned the blade on his sleeping children and removed them from their cots, placing them on the table in the kitchen. He then sat in the chair and ended his own life. One of the things to come to light at the inquest held at Aston Manor following the deaths was that Pope was a gambler. Mary Powell, Clara's mother, told the inquest Pope would lay all his wages out on gambling, returning home penniless. After losing the money, he'd be in a foul temper, and on that Saturday, shortly before the murder, it was rumoured he'd lost 14 shillings betting on football. It was also rumoured by work colleagues that he kept his wife short, keeping money to himself for betting with. More recently, however, Mrs. Powell had believed he'd had a handle on the gambling and that things at home had quietened down. She told the court that her daughter had told her Pope had tried to strangle her on at least one occasion. Pope's mother, Rose Totman Pepper, told the court that he was the son of her former husband and said that around 5 years earlier he'd suffered from rheumatic fever and that had changed him. She said his temper had been bad ever since. At the scene, a letter was found by the doctor on the mantelpiece, addressed to the coroner. It had been written in a neat hand, and there was no blood on the note. This was read out to the court. In it, Pope had written, "This is a step about which I have often contemplated, knowing it was inevitable, although I have fought against it. The inability to meet coming expenses, coupled with a very unfair system in vogue at the works, which had handicapped me for a long time, has now decided me, and I am taking dear wife and children with me, rather than they should suffer in an unsympathetic world. This is no insane action on the part of a demented man, but a carefully thought-out plan, and the easiest way out of a heap of trouble. I want to thank my mother for the many kindnesses she has shown me, and I hope she and others will not fret about things which can only be for the best. W. Pope." The jury found Pope had murdered his wife and children, then himself, but contrary to his own words, they found that he was insane at the time of the murders. The coroner and the jury expressed their sympathies to the relatives and friends of those who died. At the tubes works, the factory was in shock. The foreman couldn't believe what Pope had done, as he thought that would be the last thing he would do. He'd never seen him mix with what was termed the rough set, and he was diligent, quiet and respectable. He also said he'd never seen him touch alcohol, so believed he must have had a fit of insanity or some mental derangement. He'd been horrified when he'd learned of the note, as that was not the character of the man he knew. On Monday, 12th December, the family were laid to rest. The funeral took place at midday at Aston Parish Church in Birmingham. The coffins were taken in 3 hearses to Mrs. Pope's mother's house in Wainwright Street, from where the cortege left at 11:30. The streets leading to the church were lined with people, wishing to pay their final respects to the young family. A large crowd waited in silence at the church gates, with Detective Inspector Jackson and Inspector Lambourne keeping a watch on them in case of trouble, but there was none. The public weren't allowed into the churchyard, where the scene was described as a very sad one. Pope was brought into the church first, carried by his former colleagues at Tubes, followed by his wife. Her coffin was adorned with many wreaths from relatives, friends and neighbours. Then came the children, their coffins each having a wreath and carried by girls in white veils. The chief mourners were Mrs. Pope's elderly parents, Alfred and Mary Powell, and Mrs. Pepper, Pope's mother. Following the service, conducted by the Reverend S. McKelvey, all 4 were buried together. The Birmingham tragedy was one of the worst the city had ever experienced.